My own journey is I was raised in a Methodist family in a small town in England. I went to an Anglican boarding school, so I had a fairly conventional religious Christian upbringing. But as part of my scientific education, I quickly realized that my science teachers, most of them, were atheists, and that they regarded atheism as the normal position to have if you're a scientist. It's just part of the standard scientific worldview. Science and atheism go together. That was their view. I wanted to be a scientist, so it was part of a package deal, which I simply accepted. I was the only boy in my year at school who refused to get confirmed at the age of 14. And when I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate, I eagerly joined the Cambridge Humanist Association, the atheist organization for undergraduates. However, after going to a few meetings, I began to find it all a bit dull. The meeting that sticks in my mind most of all is when we were addressed by the great biologist Sir Julian Huxley, who was a leading humanist and atheist in Britain. And he was speaking to us about the importance of humans taking control of the evolutionary process and improving the human race. Now, negative eugenics was out of fashion by then as a result of the excesses of Nazi breeding policies before the Second World War. But positive eugenics was still fashionable among humanists like Huxley. And his answer for the improvement of the human race was the fathering of a new breed of super children who'd be fathered using fairly simple technology, sperm donation, and he enumerated the qualities which the sperm donors of the present age should have in order to create this uplift in humanity. It turned out the ideal sperm donor was someone who came from a long scientific lineage, who had a great academic achievements in biology or other sciences, who came from a distinguished family, who had good health, who was highly esteemed in public life, etc. In other words, the ideal sperm donor turned out to be Sir Julian himself. I forgot this incident, which happened when I was a second-year undergraduate, for a long time, until a couple of years ago we were visiting a friend of ours, Francis Huxley, the son of Sir Julian, who's now in his 80s. He's living in California. 90, he's now 90, and he's living in California. And soon before we arrived, he'd had a series of letters from people in England saying they had reason to believe they might be his half-brothers or half-sisters, and could they have DNA swabs for a DNA test, because they thought that they'd been conceived by artificial insemination from a special sperm donor bank that had been set up in Britain, etc. Francis refused to give swabs. The last thing he wanted to do when he was 90, to have hundreds of half-sisters and half-brothers showing up as part of his father's eugenic project. Anyway, it all seemed a bit thin, and although I wanted to believe the universe was nothing but machinery and there was no God and no consciousness and it was just blind chance that had given rise to everything, I found it a strain. It was particularly a strain when I fell in love, and I was at the time I was in love. I had this lovely girlfriend. I was trying to come to terms with these emotions, and I was going to physiology lectures where we had a series on steroid hormones, and I learned the chemical formulae of testosterone and progesterone and estrogen and so on, and learned about how these affected different parts of the brain. I learned about the nerve impulses, but somehow it seemed to leave something out, and I began to feel that just wasn't enough. And then in the biochemistry department at Cambridge, I saw a big wall poster of human metabolic reactions, all the different arrows of the chemical reactions inside our bodies. And someone had written across the top in big blue letters, "Know thyself." And again, the gap between this list of chemicals and chemical reactions and the experience of being alive just seemed unbridgeably huge. I began to feel that something was wrong with mechanistic science, and I began to look at more holistic ideas. But I started with the ideas of Goethe, the German poet and botanist. and got more and more interested in a more holistic approach to science. But I was still an atheist at this stage, and I was really trying to find a better way forward for science, a more inclusive, holistic way of understanding life. In 1968, I had a scholarship from the Royal Society to go and study tropical plants in Malaya, at the University of Malaya. And on the way there, sponsored by the Royal Society, I travelled through India. India in 1968 was a very exciting place to be. And as I travelled through India, I encountered gurus and ashrams and temples and pilgrimages. And it opened my eyes to a range of phenomena I was completely unfamiliar with. When I got back to England, I got interested in exploring consciousness. Psychedelics were around at the time, and so I had various psychedelic experiences, which convinced me that the mind was vastly greater than anything I'd been told about in my scientific education. It just didn't seem to map onto these experiences. Then I got interested in transcendental meditation because I wanted to be able to explore consciousness without drugs, or as well as with drugs. So that was very convincing. In around 1970, the way they put this across in the Transcendental Meditation Centre in Cambridge was you don't need to believe anything, because they knew that most young people were allergic to the idea of God. So no idea of God or saints or beliefs. It's just physiological. You do this, it lowers the lactic acid levels in the blood, it stimulates the brain in the right position of places to create relaxation. It was portrayed as a purely physiological way of achieving well-being and calmness. Well, that was fine by me. It worked. I enjoyed doing it, and I didn't need to believe in anything beyond my own brain. But I was intrigued by India and by yoga and by meditation. And in 1974, I had a chance to go and work in India as the principal plant physiologist at the International Crops Research Institute in Hyderabad. And I was thrilled by the idea of immersing myself in this exotic and fascinating culture. When I was in India, I visited temples, ashrams, I went to discourses by gurus, and I had a number of adventures, and some of them bizarre. I mean, there are some aspects of Hinduism are deeply profound. Other aspects are simply bizarre. And one example, this has actually got into a book. I told this story soon afterwards in London to somebody who told it to an Indian writer called Geeta Mehta, and she put this in her book Karma Cola. But this was I was visiting this guru who was supposed to be a miracle worker, and he was famous for causing messages to float from the ceiling. You'd be sitting there and sheets of paper would float down from the ceiling with profound messages on them. So I went to see him hoping to get a profound message float down. But because I was a foreign scientist, he decided I needed something more special than just a message, which was the odour of sanctity. Now, there's a tradition in many cultures that holy men have a sweet smell, the odour of sanctity. And so he said to me, he said, I am having the odour of sanctity. And so I said, oh, yes. And he said, I will show. You come with me. And he said, come. So he took me and I followed him. And he led me into a lavatory. And so there was this toilet. And he locked the door. And I found myself in this lavatory with a famous guru in his orange robes. And he said, my urine will turn to rosewater. So he got out a mug. He got it off a shelf. And he says, you watch. And I thought I should avert my eyes, but no, he insisted. So I watched him pee into this metal tumbler, and then he gave it to me. He said, it is for you. So I said, well, let's go back to... So we went back to the room, and I described what had happened to people there. And the trouble is, my sceptical mind was racing through. I hadn't seen the mug before he peed into it. Had he put concentrated rose water into it before he peed, etc.? It did smell of roses. So everybody there was amazed by this. They said, "This is a very great blessing." So I said, "Well, it's such a great blessing, I feel I must share it." So I was able to get away with only the tiniest sip, since everybody there was... Anyway, these are adventures in search of, the spirit and stuff. I had many adventures in India. I don't have time to relate any more, but this was... it was a period of extraordinarily... it was very, very fascinating. I then took up Sufism. I had a Sufi teacher in Hyderabad who was the grandfather of a friend of mine who was a Sufi saint. He taught in Germany part of the time and part of the time in India. And he and I became great friends. He gave me a Sufi mantra, a wazifa, which I, for about a year, did the Sufi form of meditation. And one thing I learned from him was that in the Islamic tradition, particularly the Sufi tradition, pleasure, worldly pleasure, is considered God-given. It wasn't puritanical or ascetic. He wore wonderful brocade robes. He wore perfume. He's sat there running his fingers through a bowl of jasmine blossom. He recited exquisite poetry. And this was because God gives these gifts. And it was a very big lesson for me, because I'd always associated religion with a kind of asceticism. But that's not the case in the Sufi world. But I didn't want to become a Sufi, because in India, to become a Sufi, you're a Muslim first and foremost, and fasting in Ramadan and that kind of thing I thought would be going a bit too far. Fortunately, I was circumcised already, so that wasn't an issue. But I thought the rest would be too much of a stretch. And then an original thought crossed my mind: what about the Christian tradition? And I hadn't given it a thought. And I spoke to a Hindu guru, and he asked him about this, and he said, all paths lead to God. You come from a Christian family, so you should follow a Christian path. And I said, well, I had never thought of that. And he said, but I found it very convincing. And the more I thought about it, the more sense it made, because among my Indian friends, the big aim of doing these forms of meditation is to get free of the wheels of incarnation. The world, according to the Hindu cosmology, is getting steadily worse. We're in Kali Yuga. We're heading towards the end of an age. And everyone's trapped in cycles of rebirth. It's not a good thing to be reborn, reincarnated. It's a bad thing, because you want to get off this hopeless world, which is headed to destruction. So what you're doing in a spiritual life is undergoing a kind of vertical takeoff, leaving the rest of the world spinning on pointlessly, and you're just getting off. Now, I just couldn't get that as the principal aim, and I realized I actually cared about... I was working to help poor farmers. It was some of my Indian colleagues at work, after work, would ask me, why do you do this? And I said, to help poor people who haven't got any. He said, that is not your business. That is their karma. He said, your business is to lead your own life to achieve liberation. But the idea that you should help other people is so deeply ingrained into the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition. It's not just about individual salvation, it's about collective change. And I realized I was far more Christian than I'd ever imagined. I started going to church, to the Church of South India, the Anglican Church in Secunderabad, and after a while I got confirmed at the age of 34 by an Indian bishop. And I felt very happy to be relocated in a Christian tradition. But I still felt a huge tension between the Hindu wisdom, which I felt was so deep, and the Christian tradition, which seemed a bit shallow on the spirituality side. When I discovered this wonderful teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, who had a Christian ashram in South India. He was an English Benedictine monk who'd lived there for 25 years when I met him in India. And in his ashram, it combined many aspects of Indian culture with Christian tradition. The Mass in the morning started with the Gayatri mantra, which is that wonderful mantra invoking the sun. So I said to Father Bede, how can you have a Hindu mantra in a Catholic ashram? And he said, precisely because it's Catholic. He said Catholic means universal. If it excludes anything, it's not Catholic. He said it's just a sect. And I really liked that approach. And I found this extraordinarily broad approach really helpful. And he became my main teacher. And I wrote my first book in his ashram, A New Science of Life. When I got back to England after a long period in India, I had a wonderful time rediscovering the Christian tradition. I loved the fact Indians have pilgrimages. Europeans have pilgrimages. There's Santiago de Compostela, the pilgrimage to Canterbury, the pilgrimage to Walsingham in England. So I rediscovered sacred places. England's full of them, great cathedrals, churches, stone circles, pre-Christian and Christian. And so I started visiting our native places. I started going to cathedrals where there's marvelous singing and these beautiful buildings resonating. And instead of just seeing it as an aesthetic experience, as I had done before, I now felt part of it, and I was very, very moved by it, and felt privileged to be part of this tradition. So since then, it's been my practice to go to church on Sundays whenever I can. The only place I can't is Cortes Island, because Christianity is almost extinct on Cortes Island. There is one church left at Cortes Bay, but it never functions in the summer when I'm here. So there's two zendos, there's kirtan chanting. Until recently, there was a Peruvian ayahuasquero. There's a Tibetan Buddhist center. The Jewish ceremonies happen here, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. Yes, but if you want to go to a Christian service, it's virtually impossible. So here is the one time I can't do this, but I normally, that's part of my practice wherever I am.